The coffee maker in our kitchen had a small crack in the carafe that I had been meaning to replace for 2 years. Every morning I watched the crack and thought about replacing it, and then made the coffee anyway because the crack was near the top, and the coffee level never reached it, and a thing that works despite its visible imperfection is, in my experience, usually worth keeping. My wife did not share this philosophy. Vanessa believed that visible imperfection was evidence of a larger failure of standards, that the cracked carafe and the 12-year-old Subaru in the driveway and the home office with the unremarkable door were not individual facts but a coherent argument, a statement about the kind of man she had married and the kind of life she was living in the distance between both of those things, and what she had imagined when she was 29, and ambitious and standing at a fundraiser in Nashville telling a man in an unremarkable jacket that he seemed interesting. Interesting had been enough for a while. Interesting has a shelf life in marriages where one person's visibility grows faster than the other's, and where the growing visibility begins to use up the room that interesting once occupied. By the Tuesday morning in September, when she sat across from me at the kitchen table with the cracked carafe between us and told me that her colleagues were beginning to ask questions, interesting had been gone for approximately 3 years. She said, "Diane asked me again last night what you do, and I said you consult." And she said, "Consult for whom?" And I said, "Small and mid-sized businesses." And she said, "What kind of work?" And I said, "Data and operations." And she just looked at me, Thomas. She just looked at me like she was doing the math on how a data and operations consultant for small businesses affords a house in this neighborhood, and coming up short. I said, "What did you tell her?" She said, "I said your family had money." I am sorry. I did not know what else to say. I looked at the cracked carafe. I thought about my father and his warehouse and the 40 years he had spent moving things from one place to another for people who needed them, moved and who never thought about the moving until it stopped. I thought about the study upstairs with the closed door and the monitors and the filing systems and the 12 legal pads stacked on the left side of the desk, and the company I had built from that desk, from that room behind that door, over 8 years while my wife walked past it every morning on her way to a job at a company I owned. I said, "You do not need to apologize for what you told Diane." She said, "I feel like I am making things up. I feel like I am inventing a professional life for you because your actual professional life does not hold up in conversation with my colleagues." I said, "What would hold up?" She said, "Something with a title. Something with a company name. Something I can point to and say, this is what he does, this is where he works, this is why it matters." Instead, I have data and operations and small businesses and Diane doing the math and coming up short. I set my coffee cup down. I said, "I need to ask you something and I need you to hear it as a genuine question and not as a defense." She said, "All right." I said, "When you try to explain what I do to Diane or anyone else, are you trying to help them understand me? Or are you trying to help yourself feel better about being married to me?" She did not answer immediately. The kitchen held the silence the way our kitchen always held silences, with the patient neutrality of a room that had absorbed a great many of them and had stopped taking sides. Then she said, "Both. And I know that is not the right answer." I said, "It is the honest one. That is more valuable than the right one." She said, "Thomas, I am not trying to be cruel. I am trying to survive a professional world that categorizes people constantly, and where my husband's category is difficult to explain, and where the difficulty reflects on me in ways that matter to my career." I said, "I understand." She said, "Do you?" I said, "More than you know." She got up. She rinsed her cup. She said she was going to be late. She picked up her bag. She left. I sat at the kitchen table with the cracked carafe and the quiet of a house that had, in the 14 years I had lived in it, held more conversations like the one I had just had than I could count. Conversations in which I was managed, positioned, preempted, framed in the specific, careful way that a person frames something they are not sure of before someone else can frame it first. I was the frame she could not get right. I poured myself more coffee. I went upstairs to the study. I closed the door. I opened my laptop. I had a board meeting at 9 and a call with my financial advisor at 11, and a decision to make about a capital allocation question that had been sitting in my inbox for 3 days, and that I had been approaching with the specific, patient deliberateness that my father had taught me was the difference between a decision and a reaction. The board meeting was for Meridian Solutions Group, my company, the company my wife left for every morning, the company that employed her, paid her salary, provided her health insurance, and administered the retirement contributions she had been making for 4 years, without knowing that the beneficial owner of the entity that managed all of those things was the man sitting at the kitchen table with the cracked carafe when she left. My name is Thomas Alcott. I am 47 years old. I was born in Memphis, Tennessee, to a woman named Eleanor, who taught American literature at a community college, and who had the relationship with language that comes from spending a professional lifetime helping other people find the words for things they already know but cannot yet say. Patient, specific, and deeply respectful of the gap between knowing and saying. My father, Richard Alcott, ran a logistics company called Delta Freight Partners out of a warehouse on the south side of Memphis. The company moved things. Agricultural products primarily. Soybeans and corn and cotton moving from production to processing to distribution through a network of trucking relationships and rail connections and warehouse agreements that my father had built and maintained and operated for 40 years with the specific, unglamorous competence of a man who understood that the world depends on people who move things and that the people who move things are never the people the world notices. I worked in that warehouse from the age of 14, not as an internship, as a job, loading and unloading and learning the routing systems and understanding, through the physical experience of the work rather than through a curriculum or a case study, how supply chains work when they work, and how they break when they break, and where the difference lives. The difference lives in decisions that seem small. It lives in the relationship with the carrier that is maintained, even when the volume does not justify the maintenance cost, because the volume will return and the relationship will be needed, and the maintenance cost is an investment that the person who does not understand supply chains will cut, and the person who does understand them will not. My father understood supply chains the way he understood people, from a long distance and with great patience and without the need for them to explain themselves before he had figured out what they were. He died in 2009, heart attack in the warehouse, with his hands on a routing manifest and his mind, I have always believed, already 10 steps ahead of the problem in front of him. He left Delta Freight Partners to me and my sister in equal halves. My sister was a pediatrician in Atlanta with no interest in logistics operations. We agreed that I would purchase her half at fair value over 5 years. By 2014, I owned Delta Freight Partners entirely. By 2014, I also owned 2 other companies I had built or acquired using the cash flow from Delta Freight and the specific structural understanding of mid-market operations that the warehouse had given me. And by 2014, I was building a 4th. The 4th was Meridian Solutions Group. I want to tell you about Meridian carefully, because Meridian is the center of the story, the place where everything converges, and centers deserve the attention they require. In 2013, I saw a gap, not a market trend, a gap. The specific structural gap that exists when large companies have solved a problem for themselves, and small companies have solved it for themselves, and the companies in the middle, the ones doing between 50 and 500 million in revenue, are living in the space between those 2 solutions, too complex for one and too resource-constrained for the other. The gap was in operational visibility. Mid-market manufacturers and distributors could not see their own supply chains clearly, not because the technology did not exist, because the technology that existed had been built for the enterprise level, where the implementation budgets were large and the IT departments were capable, or for the small business level, where the problems were simpler and the solutions could be simpler in response. The middle was being served by neither. I had operated in the middle for 20 years. I knew its problems from the inside. I knew its budget constraints and its technology limitations and the specific ways in which its operational complexity exceeded what its resources could typically address. And I knew what solving those problems was worth to the companies that had them, because the companies that had them were spending the cost of not having solutions every quarter in spoilage and delays and vendor relationship failures and inventory discrepancies that their existing systems could not catch until the damage was already done. I built Meridian to solve this, not with a product designed in a laboratory by people who understood technology, with a platform designed by a person who understood operations, who had spent 20 years watching the specific ways in which the middle of the market suffered from the gap, and who had the patience and the capital and the structural knowledge to build something that fit the actual problem rather than the problem the technology wanted to solve. I hired a CEO named Gerald Hatch in 2014. Gerald had spent 20 years in supply chain operations at a mid-market manufacturer and had the specific, practical intelligence of a person who has operated a system rather than designed one. He understood Meridian's target customer because he had been Meridian's target customer. He ran the company with the unglamorous, competent efficiency of a person who had learned everything he knew by doing it rather than studying it. By 2018, Meridian had 140 employees and $70 million in revenue. By 2020, 280 employees and $140 million. By the September morning of the cracked carafe conversation, 460 employees, operations in 9 states, and annual revenue of $260 million. My wife had joined Meridian in 2021 as a senior director of client operations. She had been recruited by a headhunter who had no knowledge of her connection to me. I had not arranged her hiring. I had not intervened in her candidacy or her offer or any subsequent career decision within the company. I had found out she was working there when Gerald's monthly personnel update, which he sent to Alcott Holdings, LLC, as part of the standard reporting structure between the operating company and the holding entity, mentioned a new senior director hire in client operations. The name on the update was Vanessa Alcott. I had sat with that piece of information for a long time, not because I was alarmed, because I was interested. The specific structural interest of a person who has been trained by decades of operational experience to understand that apparently coincidental events often have implications that reveal themselves slowly, and that the appropriate response to a slow revelation is patience rather than intervention. I did not tell Gerald. I did not tell my attorney. I did not tell Ruth Drummond, my financial advisor, who knew the full scope of my holdings and whose judgment I trusted on every financial question, and who would have had, I believed, a strong professional opinion about the governance implications of what I was allowing to continue. I allowed it to continue because I needed to understand something that I could only understand by watching it unfold without interference. I needed to understand what Vanessa actually thought about the company she worked for, not what she thought about me, what she thought about Meridian, whether the platform I had built and the culture Gerald had maintained and the values I had written on a piece of paper in a Memphis warehouse in 2014 were producing what I had intended them to produce, or whether they were a story the organization told itself while delivering something different underneath. She was the most honest source of information available to me. She had no reason to filter what she said about Meridian when she was talking to her husband about her workday. She was not managing a relationship with me. She was just talking. And the talking, over 4 years of kitchen table conversations and Sunday evening decompression, and the specific unguarded honesty that people bring to conversations with the people they share their lives with, was the most accurate operational intelligence I had ever received about a company I owned. She told me Meridian was good, many times, in many different ways. She said the culture was real, that the values were not decorative but operational, that the decisions she had watched the leadership team make in difficult situations were the decisions that a company with real values would make. She said Gerald was the best operational leader she had worked for. She said the platform actually solved the problems it claimed to solve, that her clients said so regularly, and that the renewals bore it out. She did not know she was telling me this. She thought she was telling her husband about her job. The distinction is important, because what she told me over 4 years without knowing she was telling me was that the thing I had built was what I had intended to build, not in theory, in practice, in the specific, daily operational reality of a company with 460 employees and $260 million in annual revenue that had not lost itself in the growth. That mattered to me more than I can adequately explain. It mattered because the thing I have always feared about building is not failure. Failure is instructive. What I have always feared is the specific, gradual corruption by which a thing built with integrity loses its integrity without anyone deciding that it should, through the accumulation of small compromises and convenient shortcuts, and the slow replacement of the original values with the values that growth and scale and the pressure of revenue targets tend to prefer. Vanessa told me, over 4 years, that this had not happened, without knowing she was telling me. And I told her nothing about any of it. Now I need to tell you about October. The month everything converged. It converged, as important things often do, from multiple directions simultaneously, which is the universe's way of ensuring that the person at the center cannot manage the convergence sequentially, but must receive it all at once. The first direction was Meridian's announcement. Gerald had been planning, with my approval and the board's, a company-wide celebration of Meridian's 10th anniversary. The celebration would include a formal gathering for all employees at a venue in downtown Nashville, a retrospective on the company's founding and growth, and, for the first time in the company's history, a public acknowledgement of the ownership structure and the individual behind it. This last element had been Gerald's suggestion, delivered in a board meeting 6 months earlier, with the specific, direct honesty that made him the right person to run the company. He had said, "We are 10 years old, and we have 460 employees who have given significant portions of their professional lives to this company, and who do not know who owns it. I think they deserve to know. Not for the sake of transparency as an abstract value, because the ownership story is the founding story, and the founding story is the reason the culture is what it is. And the employees deserve to understand the reason the culture is what it is, so that they can continue to be the reason it stays that way." I had agreed. The celebration was scheduled for the third Thursday in October. The second direction was Ruth Drummond. Ruth had been my financial advisor for 7 years. She was 59, precise, and had the specific, comfortable authority of a person who had been trusted with significant financial decisions for a long time, and who had learned that the most important thing about that trust was not the decisions themselves, but the relationship within which the decisions were made. She called me on a Monday in early October. She said, "I need to discuss something with you that is not strictly financial, but that has financial implications." I said, "All right." She said, "I have been reviewing the Alcott holding structure in preparation for the annual reporting, and I want to make sure I understand the personal estate planning implications of the current ownership arrangement. Specifically, I want to make sure that the beneficial ownership documentation is organized in a way that would be clear to anyone who needed to understand it quickly. A spouse, for instance, in the event of circumstances that required that understanding." She paused. She said, "Thomas, does Vanessa know about the holdings?" I said, "Not in their full scope." She said, "Does she know about Meridian?" I said, "She knows she works at a company called Meridian Solutions Group. She does not know that Alcott Holdings is the beneficial owner of Meridian Solutions Group." Ruth was quiet for a moment. The specific quality of her quiet told me she was not surprised by what I had said, but was choosing her next words with the care that a person chooses words when they want to say something true, without saying something unnecessary. She said, "I am not in a position to advise you on your marriage. I am in a position to advise you that the current arrangement creates disclosure complexity that will become increasingly difficult to manage as the holdings grow and as various legal and financial instruments touch both the personal and the corporate estate." She paused. She said, "I am also in a position to tell you, as someone who has worked with you for 7 years and who has watched you build something genuinely remarkable, that whatever reason you had for not telling her, that reason has had its full amount of time. The October celebration is going to change the disclosure landscape, regardless of your preference. I would rather the disclosure happen in a way you choose than in a way the circumstances choose for you." I sat with that. I said, "I know." She said, "Do you have a plan?" I said, "I have the beginning of one." She said, "That is better than nothing. Make sure the beginning has an end that you can explain to a reasonable person." She hung up. I made notes on the legal pad. I thought about Vanessa and Diane doing the math on my professional life and coming up short. I thought about the cracked carafe and the closed study door, and 4 years of kitchen table conversations in which my wife had told me the truth about my company without knowing it was my company. I thought about what my mother would say, which was that every story has a moment when the narrator has to decide whether to continue managing the telling or to let the truth tell itself. She would say that managed truths are always smaller than unmanaged ones, because management requires compression, and compression loses the thing that makes the truth worth telling. The third direction was Vanessa herself. She came home on a Wednesday evening in the second week of October with the specific, contained agitation of a person who has been processing something all day and has run out of processing capacity by the time they reach the driveway. She set her bag down. She did not take off her shoes first, which was her invariable habit, and the absence of which told me the agitation was real rather than procedural. She said, "I need to tell you something that happened at work today, and I need you to listen without interrupting, because I have not finished understanding it myself, and I need to say it out loud to figure out what I think about it." I said, "All right." She sat at the kitchen table. She said, "Gerald called me into his office this afternoon." Gerald never calls anyone into his office for individual meetings. He does everything in teams and in shared spaces because he believes that individual office meetings create hierarchical dynamics that he does not want in the culture. So being called into his office was already unusual. She paused. She said, "He told me that Meridian is planning a 10th anniversary celebration next month, a company-wide event. And he told me that part of the celebration will include a public disclosure of the company's ownership structure and the founding story. He said he wanted to tell me personally before the general announcement because the disclosure would involve a name that was familiar to me." She looked at me. She said, "He said the beneficial owner of Alcott Holdings, which owns Meridian, is a person named Thomas Alcott. He said he thought I should hear that from him rather than from an announcement at an all-company meeting." I sat across the table from my wife. I looked at the woman I had been married to for 11 years. I looked at her face, which was doing the specific, visible work of processing something that the existing framework could not accommodate. The recalibration happening in real time, the assumptions being revised in the specific, systematic way that careful minds revise assumptions when the evidence requires it. She said, "Thomas, is that you?" I said, "Yes." She said nothing for a long time. The kitchen held the silence. The cracked carafe sat on the counter. The clock above the stove ticked. The refrigerator hummed with the patient, indifferent regularity of an appliance that does not care what is happening in the room, only that the temperature is correct. She said, "You own Meridian." I said, "Through Alcott Holdings, yes. I am the beneficial owner of Meridian Solutions Group." She said, "I work at Meridian." I said, "Yes." She said, "I have worked there for 4 years." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you have known this entire time?" I said, "I found out when you were hired. I did not arrange the hiring. I did not know you had applied. I learned your name was on the personnel update after you had already accepted the offer." She said, "And you did not tell me." I said, "No." She said, "Why?" I looked at her. I had been thinking about the answer to this question for 4 years. Not strategically, honestly. Turning the question over and looking at it from every angle available to me, and trying to find the true answer rather than the defensible one, because the defensible one would be easy to construct and easy to deliver and would accomplish nothing except the defense of a position that I was not interested in defending. I said, "The honest answer is complicated, and some of it does not reflect well on me." "Can I give you the honest answer rather than the defensible one?" she said. "Please." I said, "When I found out you were working at Meridian, my first feeling was not alarm and not calculation. It was curiosity. I wanted to know what you actually thought of the company, not what you would have said if you had known it was mine. What you actually thought, in the unguarded, genuine way that people think about the places they spend their professional lives when they are not performing for the owner." She said, "You were using me as a source." I said, "Not in the way that makes it sound. I was not extracting operational intelligence. I was listening to my wife talk about her workday. And what she said consistently and over 4 years and without any filter or performance was that the company was good, that the culture was real, that the values were not decoration, that Gerald was the best operational leader she had ever worked for. I said, that information was the most honest assessment of Meridian that I could have received from any source. More honest than employee surveys, more honest than client satisfaction reports, more honest than board presentations, because it came from a person who had no reason to tell me anything except what she actually believed. She said, so I was an unknowing informant. I said, you were a person I loved who was telling me the truth about something that mattered to me. The context was not fully disclosed. The context should have been disclosed. I am not arguing that it should not have been. I am telling you why it was not. She said, why else? You said the answer was complicated. I said, the other part is less flattering to me. She said, say it anyway. I said, the other part is that I was watching whether you could see Meridian for what it was, without knowing it was mine. Whether the quality of what I had built, the culture and the values and the platform and the people, was visible to you independent of who had built it. Whether your judgment, when it was uncontaminated by the information about my ownership, was the kind of judgment I thought it was. She said, and whether it was. I said, yes. She said, and. I said, your judgment was exactly the kind of judgment I thought it was. You saw Meridian clearly. You assessed it honestly. You gave me, over 4 years of kitchen table conversations, the most accurate and the most valuable external assessment of my own work that I have ever received. She sat with that. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Then she said, and the part that does not reflect well on you. I said, I was also testing you. Not consciously, not with a designed protocol. But underneath the curiosity and underneath the honest listening, there was a test. A test of whether you could see value that was not announced and whether you could recognize a serious person and serious work in the absence of the markers your professional world uses to sort people into categories of relevance. I said, you have been managing my presentation for 4 years, preempting my contributions, framing me as peripheral in professional social contexts, telling Diane I consult for small businesses in the tone that means please do not probe further. I have watched this happen and I have allowed it to happen because part of me wanted to know how long it would take you to decide it was not accurate. She said, that is a terrible thing to watch someone do to you and say nothing. I said yes. It is also a terrible thing to do to someone you love without checking whether the frame fits. She absorbed that. The fairness of it. The way it distributed the accountability not to exonerate me but to be accurate, to place the responsibility where it actually lived, which was on both sides of the table. She said 4 years is a long time to say nothing. I said yes. She said I have been wrong about you for longer than 4 years. I said you have had incomplete information for longer than 4 years. Being wrong and having incomplete information are not the same thing. Being wrong implies a failure of reasoning. Having incomplete information implies a failure of disclosure. The reasoning, given what you knew, was reasonable. The disclosure failure is mine. She said, you are very generous with the framing. I said, I am very specific with the framing. There is a difference. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She looked at the cracked carafe on the counter. She said, how much is Meridian worth? I said, Meridian is currently valued at approximately $380 million. Alcott Holdings, which includes Meridian and 3 other operating businesses, is valued at approximately $530 million. She closed her eyes. She kept them closed for long enough that I watched her face cycle through several things, none of which resolved into an expression I had a name for. Then she opened her eyes. She said, $530 million, I said, approximately. Ruth's most recent assessment, it fluctuates with market conditions and the individual company valuations. She said, Ruth. I said, Ruth Drummond, my financial advisor. She has been managing the Alcott Holdings structure for 7 years. She said there is a person who has been managing $500 million of your assets for 7 years, and I have never heard her name. I said, yes. She said, "And Gerald?" Gerald knew. I said Gerald has always known. He was hired by me directly. He reports to the board, which is a board of Alcott Holdings, of which I am the principal. He has known the ownership structure since the day he was hired. She said, and for 4 years Gerald has been my direct leadership chain, and he has known that I was married to the person who owns the company, and he has said nothing. I said, I asked him to maintain confidentiality. He honored it. That is not a reflection of Gerald's honesty. It is a reflection of his loyalty to a legitimate request from the company's owner. She said, I am going to have a great deal to process about Gerald. I said, I understand. She stood up. She walked to the counter. She stood with her back to me, looking at the cracked carafe for a long moment. Then she turned around. She said, the study upstairs, the closed door, the monitors and the filing systems, and the legal pads. That is where you have been doing this. I said yes. She said, I have been walking past that door every morning for 11 years. I said yes. She said, and I thought you were answering emails. I said, I also answer emails there. She said, Thomas. I said yes. She said, how many times have I walked past that door and thought, he is in there doing his research for his small businesses, and gone downstairs and called Diane or gone to the office and complained about how difficult it is to explain what my husband does for a living. I said, I cannot count the specific number. She said, and behind the door, this whole time, was $500 million worth of building. I said yes. She pressed her palms against the counter. She looked at the ceiling. She was doing the specific visible work of a person organizing their understanding of something that requires reorganization at the foundational level. Not an adjustment, but a reconstruction, not a revision, but a beginning again from the first line. Then she said, I said terrible things to you this morning. I said, you said honest things. They were not terrible. They were a reflection of the information you had, which was incomplete because I had not given you the complete information. If the things you said were painful, the pain is mine to own, not yours, because I created the conditions for them. She said, I told you that you do not match the room. I said yes. She said, the room I was talking about. My company. That room is yours. I said yes. She said, I have been inviting you to match a room that belongs to you. I said yes. She laughed. Not a comfortable laugh. The specific, complicated laugh of a person who has just seen the full architecture of an irony that is too large to experience as funny and too precise to experience as anything else. She said, this is the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened to me. I said, I can imagine it feels that way. She said, can you? I said, I have been living inside the extraordinary for 4 years and waiting for you to be inside it with me. I have some understanding of what the entry feels like. She came back to the table. She sat down. She looked at me across the cracked carafe and the coffee cups and the 11 years of mornings that had happened at this table, and she said, tell me. Tell me everything. From the beginning. I told her. I told her about my father and the warehouse and the 40 years of moving things for people who needed them moved, and the specific, unglamorous intelligence that comes from understanding operations from the inside. I told her about Delta Freight and the inheritance and the decade of learning what I knew by doing it rather than studying it. I told her about the gap in the mid-market supply chain technology space and the specific, structural understanding of that gap that 20 years of operational experience had given me. I told her about building Meridian from a desk in the study upstairs, from the room behind the closed door, with the specific, patient, disciplined work of a person who had been trained to build from the foundation rather than from the surface. I told her about Gerald and the decision to hire someone who had operated in the middle rather than someone who had studied it. I told her about the growth and the decisions that had been hard, and the decisions that had been easy, and the culture that Gerald had built, and that she had assessed honestly over 4 years of kitchen table conversations. I told her about finding her name on the personnel update in 2021, about the decision to allow the situation to continue, about the watching and the listening and the specific honest intelligence her unguarded assessments had provided. I told her about Ruth Drummond and the Alcott holding structure, and the 4 operating businesses and the $530 million valuation. I told her about October and Gerald's conversation with her in the anniversary celebration and the decision to disclose, which had been coming for months and which her conversation with Gerald had accelerated into the same evening, rather than the following week, as I had planned. I told her all of it, for 3 hours, without compression and without management. The unmanaged truth, the way my mother had said it needed to be told, because managed truths are always smaller than unmanaged ones, and this truth deserved its full size. She listened. She asked questions, real questions, the kind that reveal genuine understanding rather than performance of understanding. She asked about the operational structure of the platform and the specific problems it solved and why those problems existed in the mid-market specifically. She asked about Gerald's management philosophy and the specific decisions that had been made when growth created pressure to compromise on culture. She asked about the other operating businesses and the relationship between Delta Freight and the logistics expertise that had informed the Meridian platform design. She asked because she understood, because 4 years of working inside the company had given her the operational context to receive the founding story with the specific, informed appreciation of someone who had seen the results of the decisions rather than just hearing the decisions described. This was not what I had expected. I had expected disorientation. I had expected the processing to take longer, for the information to require more time to organize itself into something she could engage with rather than just absorb. What I had not expected was that 4 years of working inside Meridian had prepared her to understand the founding of Meridian in the specific experiential way that only insiders can understand things. She had been inside the company for 4 years. She knew it from the inside, and now she was receiving the story of how it had been built from the outside in, from the foundation to the surface, by the person who had laid the foundation. At 11:30, she said, "I want to see the study." I said yes. We went upstairs. I opened the door. She walked in. She stood in the center of the room and looked at the monitors and the filing systems and the 12 legal pads on the left side of the desk and the coffee cup on the right and the bookshelves with the books organized by use rather than by appearance. She said, "This is where you built it." I said, "Most of it." She said, "For 8 years." I said, "Yes." She walked to the desk. She stood beside the chair. She looked at the screens which showed the Alcott Holdings dashboard and the Meridian operational metrics and the capital allocation document I had been reviewing that morning while she was telling me that Diane did the math on my professional life and came up short. She said, "You were looking at this when I talked to you this morning." I said, "The quarterly earnings review for one of the other holdings." "Yes." She said, "And you sat there and listened to me tell you that your professional presentation was insufficient." I said, "I sat there and listened to you tell me something honest that was based on incomplete information." She turned and looked at me. She said, "I owe you an apology that I do not know how to make adequate." I said, "You owe me a conversation, a real one, not an apology. Apologies close things. Conversations open them." She said, "What kind of conversation?" I said, "The kind where you tell me what you actually want. Not what you want me to be for Diane or for your colleagues or for the professional rooms you are trying to occupy. What you actually want from the next chapter of this marriage, now that the information is complete." She said, "And you will tell me the same." I said, "Yes." She said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want a marriage with enough room for both of us to be fully who we are. Not a marriage where one person's professional life occupies all the visible space, and the other person's professional life is managed and compressed and preempted, because it is difficult to explain. I want a marriage where the study door is open, where the conversations we have about work are actually about the work both of us do, rather than the work one of us does, where I am not introduced as someone who consults for small businesses but as the person I actually am, which is a person who has been building things for 20 years, and who is still building, and who intends to keep building for the rest of his professional life." She said, "I can do that." I said, "I know. You were doing it for 4 years. At Meridian. You were seeing it clearly and assessing it honestly and telling me the truth about it without knowing you were telling me. That capacity has always been there. It just has not been aimed at me directly. She looked at the desk. She looked at the legal pads. She said, "The cracked carafe." I said, "What about it?" She said, "You never replaced it." I said, "No." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because it works. A thing that works despite its visible imperfection is usually worth keeping." She was quiet. Then she said, "Are you talking about the carafe?" I said, "I am talking about the carafe." She said, "Thomas." I said, "Yes." She said, "I have spent years trying to replace things that worked because I was embarrassed by the imperfection." I said, "Yes." She said, "Including you." I said, "You were managing the presentation of something you did not fully understand. That is not the same as trying to replace it." She said, "It felt the same to you?" I said, "Sometimes." "Yes." She sat in the reading chair in the corner of the study. She sat in it the way a person sits in a room they are visiting for the first time and trying to understand from the inside. She looked at everything. The organization of it, the specific, functional logic of a room built for work rather than for appearance. She said, "What happens at the celebration?" "In October," I said, "Gerald will announce the ownership structure. My name will be disclosed to the full employee base. Your colleagues will know that the beneficial owner of Meridian is named Thomas Alcott. They will understand that Thomas Alcott is your husband." She said, "Diane will understand that." I said, "Yes." She said, "And the math Diane has been doing on my professional life." I said, "Will require revision." She said, "Significant revision." I said, "Yes." She said, "That is going to be a strange experience." I said, "I imagine it will." She said, "Will you be there?" "At the celebration?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Will you come with me?" I looked at her in the reading chair. I looked at my wife, who was sitting in my mother's chair in the study behind the door she had been walking past for 11 years, and who was asking me, after the longest conversation of our marriage, whether I would come with her to the celebration of the company I had built. I said, "I was going to ask you the same thing," she said. "Then we are going together." I said, "Yes, together." She looked at the room for a long moment. Then she said, "I want to understand all of it, not just Meridian, the other businesses, Delta Freight, the holding structure, Ruth Drummond, all of it. I want the full picture, not because of the money, because it is yours and because it is real and because I have spent 11 years married to you. And I have been looking at the cracked carafe instead of what you were building, and I am not willing to do that anymore." I said, "It will take more than one night." She said, "We have time." I said, "Yes, we have time." I want to speak to you now. I want to speak to the person who is in the room with the closed door, the person who has built something real and unglamorous and invisible, in the specific register of seriousness that is not announced and not performed and not curated for the professional social context of the people closest to them. The person whose spouse or partner walks past the door every morning and concludes from the walking past that whatever is happening behind it is not significant enough to require more information than they already have. I want to tell you what I learned in 11 years of living inside that situation, and 4 years of watching it from the specific, uncomfortable vantage point of a person who knows what is inside the room and cannot decide whether to open the door. The first thing I learned is that the closed door is not a strategy. It is a symptom. It is the symptom of a person who has built something real in a context where real things are not always recognized and who has decided, consciously or not, that the building is safer inside than outside, that what is inside the door is protected from the frame that would be placed around it if it came out. The protection is real. I do not want to minimize it. When the people who are supposed to see you have demonstrated, through 1,000 small signals over 1,000 ordinary days, that their seeing is organized around categories you do not fit, bringing the full truth of yourself into that seeing feels like a risk. The risk is that the full truth will be sorted into one of the existing categories and reduced in the sorting. And the reduction is worse than the invisibility because it is public and because it carries the authority of someone who claims to know you. So you keep the door closed. You build inside. You let the invisibility continue because the invisibility at least does not lie about what it is. But the closed door is not a solution. It is a deferral, and deferrals have costs that compound the way all deferred things compound, slowly and then suddenly, until the cost of keeping the door closed exceeds the cost of opening it, and the question is no longer whether to open it, but how. The how matters. The how is the thing that determines whether the opening is a revelation or a confrontation, a beginning or a reckoning, a room that two people can enter together, or a room that only one person was ever allowed inside. The how I have described was imperfect. It lasted 4 years longer than it should have. It required the intervention of a board decision and an advisor's phone call and a CEO's private meeting with a senior director before it produced the kitchen table conversation that should have happened years earlier. I am not recommending my how. I am describing it because it is what happened, and because what happened has the specific unglamorous honesty of a true thing, rather than the clean lines of an instructional example. The second thing I learned is that the person behind the closed door and the person who does not know what is behind it are both right about something and wrong about something simultaneously. The person behind the door is right, that what they have built is real and significant and deserves to be seen clearly, rather than sorted into an available category. They are wrong that the seeing is entirely the other person's responsibility. Seeing requires information. Information requires disclosure. Disclosure is the builder's job. The person who does not know what is behind the door is right that what is visible is real, and that their assessments of the visible are reasonable given what they have. They are wrong that visible is the same as complete. They are wrong that the frame they have built around the other person is the accurate frame. And they are wrong, most importantly, that the not knowing is a circumstance rather than a choice. Because they could ask, and they have not asked, and the not asking is itself a decision even when it does not feel like one. The third thing I learned is the most important and the hardest to say without sounding like it applies to someone else. The person you are not fully seeing is the person you are building with. And the building you are doing in the closed room, the real building, the foundation-level work that no one is watching and that is compounding quietly behind the door, that building is not a gift to yourself. It is a gift to the shared life. And gifts that are kept in closed rooms eventually stop being gifts and become secrets, which is a different thing entirely. Open the door. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Not in a way that requires the other person to receive more than they can hold in a single conversation, but progressively, consistently, with the specific, patient, foundational generosity of a person who understands that the most important building is not the building behind the closed door. It is the building of a shared understanding between two people who have decided to see each other fully. That building is harder. It has no legal pad on the left side of the desk and no coffee cup on the right. It has no dashboard and no quarterly report and no board meeting where the numbers are organized and presented in a structure that makes the progress legible. It has kitchen table conversations, real ones, incomplete ones, ones that require you to say things before you have finished processing them and to receive things that require more processing than you have available in the moment. It is the most important building. Tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight. Open the door to the room where the real work happens. Not to show the work, to share it, to say, here is what I have been building. Here is why. Here is what it means to me and why I have been building it in the space where you could not see it, and why I need you to know that the invisibility was not a choice about you. It was a choice about protecting something I was not sure would survive the looking. And then let the looking happen. Let it be imperfect and incomplete and require follow-up conversations and revision, and the slow, patient work of two people building a shared understanding of each other's reality. That is the hardest building. It is also the most important one. And it is, I promise you, worth every conversation it requires, even the ones at the kitchen table with the cracked carafe. Especially those, because the cracked carafe is a thing that works despite its visible imperfection, and things that work despite their visible imperfections are usually, in my experience, the ones most worth keeping. The soul of these stories comes from human experience, empathy, and courage. AI assisted only in language refinement, so that timeless lessons of justice, compassion, and standing up against wrong could move and educate viewers everywhere. Production team. Story and screenplay by Quinn Alcott. Character development and visual conceptualization by James Thomas. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Meridian. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to